and for those watching, Kaitlin Hendry is based in the United States. She is an HR and corporate culture consultant, but also the founder of ECPI, which stands for Equine Performance Identity. And it's that intersection that really fascinates me. I love talking to Kaitlin. She's very interesting. So Kaitlin, welcome, and let's have a bit of a chat.
Yeah, I'm really, really excited. I know you and I have talked previously and it was a really great conversation. So I'm excited to share our conversation with everyone else.
Yeah, good. So by way of a bit of introduction, I mean, anyone on the call who's worked with HR or worked with psychology and with people would know about personality trait theory, right? It's used like in Myers-Briggs, DISC, and various tools like that to see often if people are suited to a particular job or for a particular role in a team. And it deals with how our personality affects our behaviors and covers things like introversion, extroversion, conscientiousness or not, and how people work in teams, right? But what you've done, Kaitlin, is something that I don't think anyone else has done. You've combined that idea of trait theory with the study of behavior in horses. So can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you were able to combine these two fields, psychological trait theory in people with equine ethology, the study of behavior in horses?
Yeah, I mean, so trait theory is really, I don't know if most people would call it a personality test, but it's basically diving into people's personalities, right? And what specific things motivate you based on where you fall on the traits, because each trait is a spectrum of behavior. So like introversion is one side, extroversion is the other, for example. So depending on where you fall on that spectrum, you have certain needs and motivations that need to be met either as a person in a workplace or when I'm working with horses, making sure that I'm meeting the horses' needs as I'm working with them or as I'm managing their environment and that sort of thing. So my background, at least in the corporate world, as you mentioned, is in HR and kind of organizational culture consulting. This is where I got familiar with trait theory, particularly William Moulton Marston's trait theory, which is the basis for both DISC and predictive index. So if anyone's familiar with those, that's the trait theory. And I have been an avid horsewoman my whole life, pretty much. It's like third grade. And I even worked in the horse industry for a number of years before switching to the corporate world. But I've always continued to work with my own horses and kind of always kept a foot in the horse industry. And so when I started really learning about psychological trait theory, and I could then see how it also applied to horses, because horses also have personalities. We can't make the assumption that everything for people translates to horses. So that's part of what I'm doing is, questioning those assumptions and doing a bit of my own research. But it definitely applies. And so I took the jump basically to try to merge both of my worlds with ECPI to develop personality profiles for horses to help people understand what those individual needs are, in addition to, or I guess on top of meeting the horse's needs as a horse, like as a species. Once you've met those needs, then you can start to think about the individual needs and how to work with that horse to bring out the best in them.
That was quite a step to bring those fields together. And I think everybody who knows a bit about horses knows that they're not only very powerful, but very sensitive as well. And there's some amazing work done with horses, working with people with disabilities of various kinds, and horses seem to be beautifully suited to that. But as you say, every living thing has some aspect of personality in it. So could you share maybe a bit of a success story illustrating how your approach has worked in the world of horses and how it's been able to improve or shape the relationship between the horse and its owner?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I'll use my horse as an example because she has really, I mean, I've been working with horses for a long time, but she has really tested my horse knowledge,
Okay.
and my ability to really understand what her needs are. So, uh, for example, her profile, if I were to use the trait theory, is high independence, which in people it's called high dominance, but I don't, with animals, there's this whole dominance theory, and I don't know how much you're familiar with it, but with animals, for most animals, the dominance theory has really been debunked. And so I started by using the term dominance in animals, but I started getting a lot of pushback because people were misinterpreting it as me reinforcing dominance theory, when in reality it doesn't really have anything to do with dominance theory except for the word. So I use the term independence for that spectrum, and she's high independence, which means that from a needs perspective, she needs more autonomy and control of her work. And she also needs to really be mentally challenged, because if she's not mentally challenged, she just kind of checks out and doesn't want to engage at all. There's more of a what's in it for me type of approach to how I work with her. She also has situational stability, which is in people related to patience in predictive index and steadiness in disc. So I call it stability because I feel like it's just a little bit more intuitive for people who are not familiar with the trait theory. So she's situational, which means that she both needs variety in her work, but she's also very routine driven. And then she's also high structure, which in predictive index is called, I'm trying to remember now, formality. And disc is certainty, I think,
Yeah, I
or
think that's right.
conscientiousness.
Conscientiousness is in the big five, so yeah, it could be that.
Yeah, so that's structure in ECPI, and she's high structure. So she needs very clear expectations. She likes to know what's expected of her. If those expectations change or like her routine changes, she does not like it. So this is a unique challenge for me in working with her because I need the work to be mentally stimulating enough to meet her high independence needs, but it can't be so stimulating that it stresses out her high structure and she gets anxious because she doesn't know what I'm asking or gets overwhelmed. And then there's the like needing variety within the routine, but then not breaking the routine, you know?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of nuance in how I
Yes.
work with her to try to meet all of those needs. And it also influences the way that she communicates with me. In particular, if her high structure needs are being met and she knows what's expected of her, but her high independence needs are not being met, like not challenging enough, or she's not really into working that day, her communication style tends to be more confrontational.
Okay.
And so I have to listen to her and kind of adapt my way there. But if her high structure needs are not being met, then she tends to go more into flight mode versus fight mode. However, because she is high independence, her flight, when she does go into flight mode, she usually, it's just for a quick second. And then if I give her the freedom to be able to explore that and use kind of the braveness from her high independence and her curiosity from being high extroversion, she will usually figure it out on her own. She doesn't look to me, like when she's scared, she doesn't look to me to give her guidance. Like she needs the space to figure it out herself because of her high independence. So anyways, it gets very nuanced, and then they influence each other. Also, the different spectrums or different traits influence each other and how they show up. So yeah, it's been a really interesting challenge for me to learn how to apply this to horses and help people really understand those nuances of personality and motivation in their horses.
That's great. And you know your horse very well, obviously. But one of the things you kept mentioning was talking about giving her more autonomy, right? Allowing her to make decisions, to decide what to do. And I always talk about that in terms of working with people and teams, right? The more autonomy you can give people to decide how they work and when they work and exactly how they achieve their objectives, we're going to get, people are going to have more satisfaction and their performance will be better. It sounds like that's exactly the same with horses, or at least with your horse.
Yeah, I was gonna say it definitely depends on the personality, because I've also worked with people where I've told them the objective and I tell them, like, you have free reign to figure out how to get there,
Yeah.
and they're paralyzed,
Okay, yeah.
So I would say I think flexibility is big, autonomy is great when somebody's confident in what they're doing. That kind of freeze moment with people, I feel like a lot of times is driven by a lack of confidence in the knowledge, which would be high structure in XBI, high formality and predictive index, or
Yeah.
conscientious in DISC. And if they don't have that knowledge or don't have confidence in their ability to complete the task,
Yes.
even if they have full autonomy to figure it out and do whatever, they struggle with that lack of clarity.
Right. That's a great point too. Yeah. Yeah. And that you can see that in horses, you can see that in people. That's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when I work with organizations, I focus on teams, right? To people working together. It sounds like with the horses, you're working more with the individual horse. Are horses an animal that works in groups as well?
They are herd animals. So there's definitely a herd dynamic. There are also certain disciplines that involve more than one horse, like driving, for example, like competitive, like carriage rides.
Yes.
Almost, if you're not familiar with driving, you might have pairs, or you might have even four horses connected
Yes.
to the cart. Or some people do liberty with their horses, where they might be working liberties when there's nothing attached to the horse. They're all in an arena together, basically, and the handler's on the ground, and they're communicating with 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 horses. Wow. To do these movements. So there are instances where you do have to work with multiple personalities in the horse world. It's not very common, but when you're managing the horse's lifestyle and you're figuring out which horses to turn out in which fields together, you can certainly consider XBI and the horse's personalities to make a reasonable estimate or a reasonable guess of who would go best together to avoid any sort of conflict or injuries in the field.
Interesting. Now, my area is psychological safety, right? So this is when people feel they have the freedom to speak up, to bring their unique personality traits to the workplace, and to be open and honest, and challenge the way things are done. So is there a way that psychological safety shows up in your work with horses, Kaitlin?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I mean, it all comes back to them being prey animals. So safety, I mean, particularly physical safety, is a very, very high priority. But if there's a lack of physical safety, then there's going to also be a lack of psychological safety, because they're not going to be able to learn. If they feel like they're going to be punished for doing something, they start to shut down. We see learned helplessness in horses as well. So yeah, there's definitely a huge element of psychological safety to create that sort of environment where they do feel safe with you, and are you see more confidence come out of them because they're more willing to explore or try new things, because they know they're not going to get punished for it, or those sorts of things. I kind of adapted Maslow's hierarchy of needs to understanding needs of horses, where that kind of base level of needs is very basic, like food, water, shelter. And then there's the horse specific needs on top of that. Like, are they having an appropriate diet for their actual species? They're herd animals, so do they have other horses that they can be around and that they feel safe around? They also move a lot. Since they are grazing animals, they tend to, even if there's plenty of food in one area, they tend to continue to move because that's how they developed as, you know, prey and as grazing animals. And their bodies, because they're grazing all the time, their bodies adapted to being able to digest food all the time. So if they don't have a constant access to food, you get health issues like ulcers, stress, you know, just all of these things when you're not meeting those species specific needs.
Right.
So you kind of have to meet these needs in order, and then you can start to look at the individual needs. Because I think it's really important to mention that, because a lot of the behavioral issues that people are encountering with their horses is because some sort of need is not being met, whether it's a horse specific need or an individual, you know, personality need. But we have to kind of consider the whole picture. And so psychological safety really comes into play there, because first you have to meet those basic needs, and then you can start to look at how safe they feel in a learning environment.
So this, you know, you mentioned the concept of learned helplessness. So people, well, horses in this case, feeling that they just can't do anything right. I think that might be a way.
So they just shut down.
Shut down, yeah. So we see that in organizations too, right? When people have been ignored or criticized for the ideas they bring forward, they just don't speak up anymore. So when you've got a horse, or you're working with a horse that's in that state, how do you bring them back to a place where they feel they can really express themselves and they can take the lead in things?
Well, there's a lot of undoing that needs to happen. I mean, they say with feedback and positive versus negative interactions, you should try to outweigh the negative 5 times with good things.
Now we're talking about horses here, or people, or both?
Well, that ratio is based on feedback with people or positive interactions. I think it actually was rooted in a marriage study. They could predict with like fairly high accuracy which couples were going to get a divorce based on how often they said positive or negative things to each other. But I think that carries through with, you know, feedback for performance or working with horses. And so when you think about if a horse has encountered learned helplessness, or you're working with a team member who's just decided to not try anymore, you have to think about how long they were in that state also, because if that 5-to-1 ratio rings true in this scenario, if somebody's been shut down or have had primarily negative experiences for a whole year, it might take 5 years to counteract that and get rid of those like these instincts that they've developed to just not even bother. So with horses, it's just a lot of positive reinforcement. You don't want to overwhelm them. Like in animal training, they talk a lot about thresholds and not wanting to get the horse or the dog over threshold, because that's when they start to shut down again, or potentially see other issues. If they're not in learned helplessness, they'll get frustrated or they'll get scared. So we want to avoid those states of mind, and just use a lot if they've already developed that as an instinct, like their threshold's been lowered, you have to just very, very slowly, with positive experiences and positive reinforcement, start to increase that threshold again.
Okay.
It's a challenge,
So are there any other areas where you can apply, or because you're working in HR as well, right? So what I'm really interested in, the things that you've learned from working with horses, are you able to apply them when you're actually working with people in organizations? Can you give me maybe some examples of that?
Yeah, the biggest one that comes to mind for me with horses and being able to apply that to working with people is the amount of self-awareness and self-reflection that you need to have when working with horses. And to understand what I mean by that, I have to go a little bit into like the neuroscience of horses. Is they have a prefrontal cortex, which in people is for higher level thinking, like reasoning, critical thinking, planning, those sorts of things. Now, horses have a prefrontal cortex, but it is not nearly as developed as people. And its primary function is like choice of movement. Like I'm gonna choose to move over here. I'm going to choose to eat this blade of grass instead of this blade of grass, more like that. So horses don't have the ability to self-reflect or plan. That all falls on the person working with that horse. So there's a lot of self-awareness involved of like, I can tell this horse is getting frustrated. What need am I not meeting? How can I approach this differently? Or even like, I wonder if something's hurting them. Like it might not even be behavioral, but is the saddle hurting them? Is the bit not sitting right in their mouth? Are they, is something else hurting them? So it's really, working with horses has been just huge for developing emotional intelligence, awareness of body language. And those are all things that I can apply to working with people in my HR work, and helping them then also understand what that looks like and how that impacts their ability to work with their teams.
So you're telling leaders to look at their people and think, well, what is going on inside this person's head? Are they feeling uncomfortable about something? Is something worrying them or frightening them in some way that's holding them back? And what could that possibly be?
Last time you and I spoke, we had talked about the SCARF model.
Right.
So for those, if you don't know what the SCARF model is, generally, if somebody's having some sort of reaction to something, it's because of one of 5 reasons: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. So, and you can apply that to horses too, probably, but specifically with people, rather than just saying, oh, this person just doesn't want to do it because they're lazy, or, they're always showing up late because they don't care about this job, or, those sorts of things, a fundamental attribution error where you're attributing behavior due to their personality instead of environmental factors. SCARF's a really good model to then say like, okay, well, I'm observing this behavior from them. Might it be because their status is getting threatened? Might it be because they're losing autonomy in their work, or certainty? They don't know what's going to happen. They don't know what to expect. They don't know how to do this thing. So instead of just having that fundamental attribution error where you just attribute it to their as a personality characteristic, you can reflect and try to look at things from their eyes. And you can use that model as part of the conversation. Like, I'm observing this behavior from you. I'd really like to make sure that I'm supporting you the best way possible. Can you maybe look at this model and tell me what's resonating right now? Like, what are you feeling? What can I change? Always approaching the situation with empathy and wanting to understand where the other person is coming from, rather than just punishing them, being like, you're lazy, I'm going to cut your pay, or, that doesn't actually solve the issue at hand.
I love that, Kaitlin. That's beautifully expressed. And let me ask you this, right? If the person has the ability to reflect themselves and to give you verbal feedback, does that mean people are easier to work with than horses?
Oh, that's a very complex answer, I think. What I like about horses, and what I think in some ways makes them easier to work with, is that what you see is what you get.
Right.
So they're similar to toddlers, like human toddlers, where they have an emotion, they feel it, you know they're feeling it. There's no hiding of what they're feeling. And you're forced to then like take a step back and say, what's going on here? Yes, they can't talk and tell you. And so there's a little bit of critical thinking that has to happen on your part to figure out what's causing that emotion. So that makes it, one of the challenging elements of working with horses. But on the flip side, with people, we have the ability to kind of show up how we think we're supposed to. So if there isn't that psychological safety there where they feel like they can just show up as their full selves and be fully welcomed and belong as who they are, it's a lot trickier to get to know somebody and how to work with them and how to motivate them and how to set them up for success, because you may not be seeing what is really truly them.
That's very interesting.
So yeah, I mean, it all applies to kind of both fields, but they each have their own complexities.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So is there anything else that you when you're working with organizations or working with leaders that you talk to them about what they can learn from your work with horses? Are there any other points there that you'd like to mention?
I think with horses, it helps you understand clear communication. That's probably another big one. Because you can't verbally communicate your plan, right? So when, as much as possible, you want to set the horse up for success, right? So being able to get the horse to kind of the outcome that you want without actually being able to tell them like, just do this and this and this and this.
Yeah.
It makes you really think about, how do you break down, what are all the like sub steps in between where you are currently and the final goal to get you there. And I think that can be applied to project teams as well. Or even developing, if you want someone on your team to develop a certain skill, what are the micro steps to get them to that? Because just saying, hey, I want you to develop this skill, especially for people who, you know, are high structure or formality or conscientiousness, that's probably overwhelming, and they're probably looking at that and being like, I don't even know where to start learning that skill. But if you take those micro steps and really, they call it a shaping plan in horse training, where instead of just saying, I want you to learn how to, you know, analyze this in Excel, it's like really breaking down the steps into basically fail-proof steps to get people where they are. And that is something I mean, it lacks a little bit in the horse world too, to be honest with you. But I think in the corporate world, there's a lot of just throwing people in the deep end and seeing who swims and who drowns.
Yes.
From a psychological safety point, it's not the greatest way to learn. And so I would really love to see the corporate world take a more intentional approach to nurturing talent. And not just being like, well, I had to figure it out when I first started out, you know. It's like, well, is that really the best way to do it though? Let's not just do something that's how you did it, you know. Let's make it better for the next generation.
Yeah, there's just a wonderful lesson here in looking at different perspectives on issues, isn't there? I think, you know, just saying, well, how does a horse approach this, gives you so much insight into different ways you can approach an issue in the workplace. And I think that's the real power in what you're doing, Kaitlin. Do you take organizational leaders out to work with your horses? Is that part of what you do?
It is not. However, there are many people who do that. And there's a certain element of coaching that's involved in helping an individual understand their horse. But as far as helping to develop leaders by working with horses, that is not part of the scope of FBI. But if anybody is interested in that, I do have many horse connections with people who do like equus coaching, or something similar where you can do more leadership development, etc., with horses.
Yeah, great. Okay. So, Kaitlin, I think we've covered a lot of ground here, right? I'm just looking at some of the questions we prepared. Anything else that we could bring out here? I think you've brought out some really fascinating points. Yeah, anything else that you'd like to say about specific applications and potential benefits in the professional setting from the work that you do?
In a professional setting, like the corporate world?
Yeah, the corporate world.
Well, I mean, I think the main thing to take away from using psychological trait theory in the workplace, whether you use DISC or Myers-Briggs or predictive index, or I don't think Clifton Strengths is technically psychological or psychological trait theory, but it kind of falls under behavioral self-assessments. I think the main takeaway, if anyone wants to use psychological trait theory in getting to know their teams, is that it is the foundation of a conversation. I never recommend that somebody just like asks their team to get these profiles and then read it and never talk about it. I think that can do more damage than good. It is a self-assessment, so hopefully what comes out is pretty accurate because it's based on what you put into it. But every once in a while, like something doesn't resonate with somebody, and you don't want to be working with them assuming that everything in their profile works or makes sense for them. So over time, if you didn't use some sort of profiling tool, you would figure out what motivates somebody, what frustrates somebody, what sort of work they enjoy, what gives them energy versus what drains them. You would probably over time figure all of that out.
Yeah.
But what using these profiles does is it exponentially, I think, increases how fast you get to that outcome. And so if you're using psychological trait theory, just always use it with the understanding that it's really great conversation, really great way to get to know people, whether their profile resonates with them or not. Being able to pick apart what doesn't resonate is just as helpful as what does. So that would probably be my biggest lesson is that it shouldn't just be taken at face value, like really needs to be discussed. And the other thing related, you mentioned that a lot of these tools are used for whether or not somebody's a good fit for a job. And I will say that, especially with people in particular, not so much with horses, but with people, we can be good at whatever we want to be if we put in the time and effort to develop those skills. So even if somebody's profile is not a perfect match for a job, it doesn't mean that they won't be successful. What it does mean is there's probably more elements of the job that are going to be just mentally taxing because they're learning a new skill, or if someone's not naturally really organized and then they're part of a job, or they're in a job that requires a ton of organization and logistics and coordination like that, it's just at the end of the day, you're just going to be tired.
Yeah.
So what using psychological trait theory is useful, it's not useful to determine who's going to be good at a job, but it is really helpful for understanding burnout and whether or not the job might be able to be tweaked to allow the person to do more things that give them energy versus drain them, and how you can support them and still being successful in the role. So I never really tell people to make job hiring decisions like based on a profile. I use it more as, well, this will help you understand how you can help them be successful in it. Just because their profile isn't a perfect match doesn't mean that they won't be good at it.
Yeah, totally agree with everything that you said there. So it's, they guides to conversations, they help you find a common language, and they help you identify an area where someone might need additional support. So I think that's right. You seem really sensitive to these things in people. Okay? And do you think working with horses has made you more sensitive to the way that people are?
That's a good question. I mean, I've always been just fascinated in motivation. And even before I knew about psychological trait theory, when I was working with horses, I loved when you could see the light bulb click, and they
Yeah.
knew what you finally, like, they finally understand what you're asking, and
Right.
it's really cool to see those things happen. So I don't know. I guess I don't know. Or maybe my sensitivity is what's led me, to loving working with horses, and chicken or the egg, I guess.
Yeah, yeah,
That's a
maybe.
really great question.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it probably has made me more sensitive to body language. Just I've had a lot of practice with horses.
Yeah.
The body language is obviously different because we're different species, but
Yes.
the critical thinking process of, oh, I just observed that, what does this mean? That process still happens with people. So that
Yeah.
I probably have become, I would credit horses to becoming more sensitive from that aspect of
Mm.
being able to read between the lines a bit and kind of get down to what the root cause of some sort of behavior is or motivation.
So you pick up and go, oh, there's something going on here that is not being
Yeah.
fully expressed, and then you realize, okay, let's dig into this a bit more and see what's really happening. Yes.
I do also have, full disclosure, have ADHD, and I have heard that a lot of neurodivergent folks tend to be more sensitive to things like that. I'd have to do a little bit more digging, but just throwing that out there as a
Yeah, fascinating.
potential factor as well. Yeah.
Fascinating too. And yeah, that's, these some of these neurodiverse traits are superpowers in themselves, aren't they? And really bring benefits. I was telling people in organizations about this, right? These are not things to hold people back. These are actually powers that can,
Right.
have great strengths in the right circumstances. So
Exactly. Yep.
So, Kaitlin, if people want to learn more about you and the work that you do, how can they get in touch?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that question. If you're interested in ECPI, equine performance identities, and the applying psychological trait theory to working with horses, my website for that work is equineperformanceidentities.com. I actually also own horsepersonalities.com. So if that's easier to remember, you feel free to go to that one. It will just redirect you to my other site. And in that vein as well, on social media, if you wanted to see my social media accounts for that, the handle is horse personalities also. So that makes it nice and easy. And then if you're interested in speaking with me about HR, culture, organizational development, employee experience, all those sorts of fun parts of HR, as I call them, you can connect with me on LinkedIn at Kaitlin Hendry.